In the long shadow of Rome's marble columns and sprawling empire, there are stories that rarely make it into textbooks. They are stories of brutality, power, and survival. Welcome to our channel, where we dive deep into the hidden history of sex, sexuality, and the shocking practices of the past. Tonight we're venturing into the heart of ancient Rome, not to celebrate its grandeur, but to uncover the most horrifying crimes committed against women. Crimes that reveal a darker, disturbing side to one of history's most legendary civilizations. What you're about to hear may unsettle you, but it's a necessary reminder of how power and violence shaped not just empires, but human lives. So let's begin where conquest and cruelty often went hand in hand, on the battlefield. When Roman legions marched into foreign lands, they carried not only swords and shields, but also the unspoken permission to brutalize those they conquered. Women in defeated cities were seen as spoils of war, objects to be claimed by victorious soldiers. Ancient sources describe entire populations being enslaved, and within that system, women were often the first to suffer. They were paraded naked in triumphs, displayed as living trophies of conquest, before being sold in the markets of Rome or distributed among the soldiers as rewards. Imagine the chaos: a city in flames, families torn apart, and women dragged away to face fates worse than death. For them, the collapse of their city meant the collapse of their dignity, their safety, and any control over their own bodies. To the Romans, this wasn't merely collateral damage, it was a demonstration of dominance, a performance of power designed to humiliate both the women and the men who failed to protect them. But these horrors didn't just happen far from Rome's heart. Within the city walls itself, women were subject to laws and punishments that placed their sexuality under strict, often brutal control. Adultery, for instance, wasn't just frowned upon. It was criminalized under Augustus's infamous Lex Julia. And while men's affairs were often overlooked, women caught straying could face terrifying consequences. Fathers had the legal right to kill daughters caught in the act. Husbands could publicly shame, divorce, and even execute their wives with little repercussion. What's worse, some of these punishments weren't carried out behind closed doors but staged for others to witness, embedding fear into every Roman woman's daily existence. Here we see how Rome weaponized not just the sword but the law, to ensure women lived in a state of permanent vulnerability, their very survival dependent on the whims of the men around them. Still, even within the strict boundaries of Roman society, the extremes of cruelty are best seen in moments of spectacle. Rome's arenas weren't only places for gladiators to fight. They were also stages where human suffering was carefully choreographed for the masses. Ancient accounts describe women forced into public execution through sexualized violence. In some cases, condemned women were stripped, tied, and subjected to theatrical reenactments of myths. Scenes where a woman might be raped by a man dressed as a god, or worse, exposed to wild animals in so-called damnatio ad bestias. For the Roman crowd, it was entertainment. For the women, it was a death designed to humiliate them before it destroyed them. When we think of the Colosseum, we often imagine gladiators, lions, and the roar of the crowd. But woven into that same noise were the cries of women who became pawns in Rome's obsession with dominance, spectacle, and cruelty. And as the empire expanded, these practices traveled with it. The further Rome reached, the more women it consumed. Entire provinces were stripped not only of resources but of their daughters, mothers, and sisters. Some were dragged into brothels, some into slavery, others into the private chambers of Rome's elite. Even the upper-class Roman matron, shielded by wealth and status, wasn't safe from the terrifying weight of these systems. The crime wasn't just what was done. It was the normalization of it, the way a society could build itself into a superpower on the suffering of those it considered expendable. This is where our story takes a darker turn. Because Rome's crimes against women were not only physical, but also psychological. They were designed to leave lasting scars, to remind entire populations who held the power. And as we move deeper into this history, we'll uncover even more chilling details about how control, sexuality, and violence became entwined in Rome's pursuit of dominance. The cruelty we've already seen is disturbing, but what makes Rome's treatment of women even more horrifying is how calculated it was. The brutality wasn't just spontaneous, It was systemic, institutional, and in many cases, ritualized. While conquests and punishments left scars on the battlefield and in the courts, the empire also built structures that turned the abuse of women into an everyday industry. Slavery in Rome wasn't just about field labor or household chores. It was a machine that fed on human bodies, and at its core were women who had been reduced to commodities. In bustling markets, women of every age were put on display, their bodies inspected by potential buyers as though they were livestock. There are chilling descriptions of how sellers would advertise them: their youth, their beauty, their fertility, all turned into selling points. Buyers didn't hide what they were looking for. Some women were purchased as domestic slaves, yes, but many were bought with the clear intent of sexual exploitation. For these women, there was no escape, no legal protection, and no recourse against abuse. They were expected to submit, to endure, to survive as best they could. Rome's legal system codified this exploitation. A slave woman had no identity separate from her master. Her children, born into this system, were immediately slaves themselves, perpetuating a cycle of abuse and despair that stretched across generations. Yet even beyond slavery, there was another terrifying layer. In Rome's brothels, many women were forced into prostitution, often as a direct result of conquest or enslavement. These brothels weren't hidden in back alleys, they were everywhere, woven into the fabric of Roman daily life. Some were small, dingy rooms with crude paintings on the walls. Others were grander establishments, but the reality inside was the same. Women with no choice, trapped in endless cycles of exploitation. Unlike the courtesans of later centuries, these women had little control over their clients, their earnings, or their futures. Their bodies were consumed by soldiers, sailors, and citizens alike, leaving them vulnerable to violence, disease, and degradation. To Rome, they were not people. They were a service, an outlet, a resource to be drained. Even those women who managed to live in elite circles weren't entirely safe from sexual violence. Power in Rome meant entitlement, and men at the top often believed that entitlement extended to the women around them. Emperors, senators, generals, they wielded absolute control over the lives of the women in their orbit. We know of emperors who treated their wives, sisters, and daughters as pawns in political games, marrying them off for alliances or discarding them when convenient. And worse, we hear of instances where powerful men forced themselves on women with impunity, their victims silenced by fear of retaliation. In some cases, women were accused of tempting their attackers, shifting the blame from the abuser to the abused. It's a familiar narrative, one that echoes into modern times, but in Rome, it was amplified by the state itself, which codified male dominance as the natural order of things. Perhaps most disturbing is how these crimes weren't merely tolerated, they were often celebrated. Roman writers, while occasionally sympathetic, more often turned such stories into cautionary tales or even entertainment. Plays, poems, and stories circulated about women who were captured, violated, or punished, their suffering turned into lessons about loyalty, chastity, or patriotism. Some of these myths were staged in theaters, reenacted in arenas, or carved into monuments. Imagine living in a society where your trauma could be turned into someone else's amusement or moral fable. The dehumanization was complete, not just in action, but in memory. And still, the most chilling reality is this. These crimes weren't viewed as crimes at all. They were seen as natural, even necessary for maintaining Rome's dominance. Women's suffering was not a flaw in the system, but part of the system itself, woven into the very foundation of the empire. From the law courts to the slave markets to the imperial palace, the message was the same. Women's bodies were never their own. As we move into the final part of this story, we must confront not only the horrors themselves, but the legacy they left behind. Because while Rome eventually fell, the systems it created, the attitudes it normalized, and the violence it justified echoed for centuries to come. The empire may have crumbled, but the shadow of its treatment of women has lingered far longer than its marble ruins. The terrifying truth is that the crimes Rome committed against women weren't erased with its fall. They were inherited, adapted, and repeated in countless societies that followed. The enslavement of women as spoils of war, the exploitation of their bodies in markets and brothels, the silencing of their voices under legal systems built to control them. These patterns didn't vanish when the last emperor was dethroned. They spread across Europe into the Middle Ages and beyond, shaping the way women were seen, valued, and treated for generations. One haunting example lies in the persistence of sexual violence as a tool of war. What the Romans normalized on conquered battlefields set a precedent repeated in conflicts across history. From medieval crusades to modern wars, the brutal idea that women are part of the in reward for victory can be traced back to the practices of Rome. It is not just history, it is a legacy of horror that we still see in our world today. And yet amidst this bleakness, there are also stories of resistance. Ancient texts tell of women who took their own lives rather than submit to Roman abuse, choosing death as their final act of autonomy. Others fought back in whatever ways they could, protecting children, resisting slavery, or preserving their dignity against impossible odds. These stories remind us that even in the face of overwhelming violence, women found ways to assert their humanity. Still, Rome's cruelty left scars that cannot be ignored. Even in literature and mythology, women's suffering was romanticized, often portrayed as noble sacrifice or moral lesson rather than sheer horror. The myth of Lucretia, for instance, tells of a woman who took her own life after being raped by a Roman prince, sparking a political revolution. While Rome celebrated her as a symbol of virtue, what gets lost in the telling is the sheer cruelty of her experience. Her suffering was appropriated, transformed into a story about men, politics, and power, rather than about her own trauma. This pattern repeated over and over again. Women's pain turned into narrative fuel for others' glory. When we strip away the marble, the myths, and the grandeur of Rome, what remains is a sobering truth. The empire's power was built not just on legions and laws but on the systematic degradation of half its population. Women were conquered alongside cities, punished alongside criminals, exploited alongside slaves. They were silenced in life and often silenced again in history, their suffering minimized or forgotten. To tell their stories now is not only to confront the darkness of Rome, but to recognize how that darkness still lingers in our world today. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden beneath the ruins. The Roman Empire may be long gone, but the questions it forces us to ask remain urgent. How do societies justify cruelty? How do they normalize the suffering of women until it becomes invisible? And most importantly, how do we break free from legacies that stretch back thousands of years? We've traveled through the hidden corners of Roman history tonight, uncovering stories that textbooks often leave behind. From the brutality of conquest to the cruelty of law, from the horrors of slavery to the twisted entertainments of the arena, the crimes Rome committed against women are among the most horrifying in history. But remembering them is not about shock value. It's about honoring the voices that were silenced, bringing their stories back into the light, and recognizing how power and violence have shaped our world. If this journey has surprised you, unsettled you, or made you think differently about the empire we so often romanticize, let us know in the comments. Which fact shocked you the most? And how do you think these forgotten stories should be remembered today? Don't forget to subscribe for more explorations into the hidden history of sex, sexuality, and power across civilizations. Because the past is darker than we often imagine, but only by facing it can we truly understand it.